welcome Doug Ferguson to speak on the Bob Hayward journey. So I'm just going to read a bit of a bio on Doug. So Doug Ferguson has been a boater most of his life. He has built 5 boats, the first in his early teens. It was a small 3-point hydroplane inspired by the exploits of Supertest II. Doug is not an Embro native, but he comes close. He came to Embro when he was about 3 months old and moved away at the age of 6. He and his wife Janice returned to Zora about 30 years ago, following his career in public relations with the Ontario Water Resources Commission, Sir Sanford Fleming Community College, and 3M Canada, where he retired as Manager of Media Relations and Crisis Communication. For a number of years, he and Janice have been involved in volunteer work at the museum, which serves both Zora and Southwest Oxford townships. Doug has served on the museum board as well. His current involvement is through the Zora Heritage Committee of the Beachville District Historical Society. So after the presentation, there will be a question period, as well as there will be some light refreshments in the kitchen, so be sure to take advantage of those. We also welcome Don Hilborn of the Thistle Theatre. There he is, waving. He'll be selling tickets for the upcoming adaptation, Miss Supertest, the Bob Hayward journey.
Monica, can you try tipping that microphone a bit, because you can barely hear in there.
Okay, how's this?
I think that's better.
Yeah, okay. I can always turn it up too.
Yeah, as much as you can.
Yeah.
Maybe,
Yeah, and then I want to also point out some of the actors. Some of the actors are here for the upcoming theater production, so raise your hand,
and
those who
too.
are involved. Yeah, wonderful, awesome. Yeah, and feel free to tour around the museum as well when the presentation is over. We have lots of exhibits that's open, and we have a temporary quarry exhibit that's new, so check that out as well. And yeah, all good. I'll give the floor to Doug.
Well done, organized chair preaching. Maybe. Great. Well, thanks for coming. I'd like to acknowledge some folks that are here. We've got Scott Hayward, who's Bob's nephew. We've got Mark Hayward, who's Bob's nephew. We've got Cody Hayward, who's Mark's son. And we're about that. About it. Yeah. Oh, Scott's daughter is here somewhere. Oh, there we are. Right there. Yeah. And her husband, Cornet. So, Scott and Mark will be handling the Q&A. They know the family situation and stories a lot better than I do. I'd also like to thank Don Gauthier, who brought the displays on this side regarding Miss Canada IV, Supertest, and Tempo 7. I'd also like to thank the Ingersoll Cheese and Agricultural Museum for the loan of propeller mold for Miss Canada, Miss Supertest II. And I'd also like to thank the curator of this museum, Sydney Williams, and Monica, who just spoke, Van Ederson. These folks have been very, very helpful, and they always are. Thanks very much. So here we go. I'm old enough to remember the days when Zora Township native Bob Hayward became a Canadian hero and international celebrity by driving Supertest Petroleum's unlimited hydroplanes, Miss Supertest III, to the pinnacle of powerboat racing. He brought the International Harmsworth Trophy to Canada 3 years in a row, defeating the best the U.S. had and igniting national pride. Now today, when I mention Supertest and Bob Hayward, this kind of thing, anybody under the age of about 60, there's a blank look. And that's, when you think of it, logical. but it's a story worth remembering, and I thought it would be a good thing to put something together with the collaboration with the family. And so particularly I was interested in Bob Hayward's background. There's tons of things written about the boats and Supertest racing era. It's readily available on the internet, and there's a couple of great books, Rooster Tail and Harmsworth Hero, both by John Joseph Kelly. So tonight I'd like to look more deeply into Bob's days in Zora, his mechanical wizardry with cars, which goes mostly unmentioned in most of the things. He's a chicken farmer. That's how they describe him in most of these things. Well, he was that too. Really how he came to be put behind the wheel of probably the fastest racing, the fastest racing boat in the world. As I say, it's put together with a collaboration with Bob's family and his best friend Dick Patterson, one of the few remaining people who has first-hand knowledge. Our goal was to paint an accurate picture, separating fact from legend when we can. In the beginning, on April 1st, 1921, Bob's parents, Arthur Hayward and his new bride, Edith, along with Arthur's brother, Gordon, bought a farm at Cody's Corners for $2,600. Things have gone up a bit since then. It is located south of Embro at the southeast corner where County Road 6, the Tollgate Road, which was then Cody's side road, and line 39 meet. That's that line that goes off at an angle. A cairn at the intersection is on the former corner of the Hayward farm. Now, the Haywards were progressive and forward-thinking folks. They became among the first farms to have a hay baler, a combine, a hydro, flush toilet, milking machine for the Ayrshire cows, and a television set. We'll talk about that a little later. Arthur and Gordon earned extra money by graveling local roads, and Arthur bought out Gordon's share of the farm in 1949 for $4,000. It's terrible about inflation, eh? Arthur and Edith had 3 children. Keith was born July 11th, 1926. Bob came along pretty quickly. Now, the whole family were avid readers. Parents encouraged their children to offer their opinions and involved them in discussions about local and world happenings. It's a bit unusual for that time. I missed a slide. On the left is Bob and Francis, of course, and Keith. Model airplanes are in their hands. That was one thing they were involved in, among other things. Now, both boys were early adapters. For example, they were the first in the neighborhood to have a snowmobile. Bob and Keith were very close and shared many of the same interests throughout adulthood. Bob was mathematically inclined and could do calculations in his head that made most folks look for paper and pencil. Keith finished high school, but Bob completed only 2 years, high school dropout. All were musically talented. Keith played the accordion, Bob was saxophone and clarinet, and Francis played the piano. They had local, both Bob and Keith were involved in local dance bands, and they had Sunday jam sessions at the farm and that kind of thing. Bob had kind of an entrepreneurial spirit. When 18 or 19, he spent a winter in Florida working in the orchards. He also played in dance band down there. He contracted to paint all the steel bridges in Zora, and I understand there was a little bit of wondering why and how somebody would tackle that job as he did. But he completed it in record time using a powerful spray bait compressor that he built himself. The brothers bought 2 car haulers and contracted with Chrysler to take cars to Saskatchewan. Later they changed to bulk haulage, which Keith operated until his death in 1995. Bob also had 3,000 laying hens, then 9,000 broilers. and he hated chickens. He was quiet, unassuming, polite, and honest, and there were qualities that stayed with him all his life. Both brothers worked hard, but cars and boats were always in the background. Each had a strong attraction to things mechanical and things that went fast. Boats came into the picture very early. The first boat was a rowboat, probably built in the basement. Next was a utility outboard racing runabout, Pokey. Now there are two versions of Pokey. Pokey 1, Pokey 2 was an improved version. That was my first and pretty well only brush with the Hayward folks. There were a lot of people from this area that had boathouses and things down at Long Point on the old cut. And like my dad shared a boathouse with Rib and Brenneman, the car dealer in Embro, and Haywards were down around there too. And the brothers were fooling around with Pokey one day and asked me if I would like a ride. My mother didn't think much of the idea, but my father was much more open-minded, and he said okay. I've never forgotten that. And it was Keith, must have been Keith that was driving, and I was way up front to hold the thing down. Now the picture that should be on the screen, that just shows the boat taking off. When in full flight, it was running pretty flat and fast, but he's just bringing it up at that point. Now, some of Bob's future things started here. He was the mechanic, Keith was the driver. Now, while talking to a California outboard motor parts supplier, Bob was told he could get a better price if he was a business. Within minutes, Bob's speed shop came into existence. In that day, engine modifiers had to make most of their own parts, but Bob soon was supplying some of the available speed equipment to local car people. He was just 20 years old at that point. Now, their fathers encouraged their interests, and in 1954, he told the boys that if they built a cabin cruiser, he would supply the engine, and he was as good as his word. Now, this is interesting. It just gives an example of how things get twisted and legends take over. It's widely published that they built this boat in the basement of their farm home and then had to take part of the wall out. When you take a look at the size of that thing, there's no way in the world that you could build it in a basement that had a 7-foot ceiling probably at the most. And there's another good point too. None of those Haywards were that stupid. Anyway, Bob's passion was making cars go fast, and he was very, very good at it. His car was a red. His car was a red 1938 Chevrolet business coupe. It was he modified the original 6-cylinder engine, and the car proved unbeatable getting away from stoplights in London. I should explain some of that too. People were in a hurry back then. And following the war, on Friday nights, the 4-lane stretch of Dundas Street in front of the Armories and the old Hotel London, right in there, 4 lanes. 2 cars could safely run side by side, and if both were in a hurry to get to the stoplight, you had a drag race. It attracted hot rodders for miles around, and it was. I mean, if that was happening today, they would have the army in there and they'd be shooting them with tanks and everything else. But it wasn't that way back then. Now Bob would appear and win a couple of runs with his coupe, and then he'd vanish, and no one knew who he was, and they were really wondering about that. And one night he raced an out-of-towner named Dick Patterson, who had a very fast Ford. At the end, they turned off Dundas in opposite directions, circled around a few blocks, and totally met by chance at an intersection. Bob parked his car, the two chatted, and a lifelong friendship was born. They'd had many adventures. But I'll just leave that coop slide up because this is the era we're talking about. TV sets in the 40s were available, but they were virtually no good unless they had an antenna. The closest station really was in Detroit. This is before London and Kitchener. So no one was really supplying or building antennas or installing them. So Bob was already selling a couple of brands of TVs from Bob's feed shop. It was a very diversified operation. But the lack of antennas was a huge problem since the sets themselves are practically useless without these things. But it was the same problem with other retailers, they realized. So Bob built an antenna from plans in Popular Mechanics or something like that. I topped one of the trees at the house, installed this antenna on the family farm, pointed it at Channel 2 Detroit, and it came in beautifully. Bob's speed shot empire was expanded once again by the addition of an antenna supply and installation business. Dick was the front person selling their services to TV stores and was also the assistant installer. He was afraid of heights. Bob wasn't. Bob was the fabricator and the installer. Bob's brother Keith began repairing TV sets, a business he carried on for some years. Most of what they earned, Dick says, went back into their car hobby, although Dick had enough left over to buy himself a brand new car for general transportation, so they were doing okay in this deal. Bob replaced the engine in his coupe with a straight 8 Buick engine, heavily modified. The coupe's original engine went into Dick's Ford. One modification to the Buick was a dual-point ignition system designed and built up with the help of ignition testing equipment used after shop hours at Reuben Brenneman's General Motors garage in Embro. They had to leave by 8 p.m. when Rib left his office, or he would simply turn the lights out on them. When Bob wanted to lighten the coupe chassis, he consulted with Bruce Wells of Wells Foundry and Machine Shop in London regarding strength of materials, etc. Along with Wells' two sons, he and a few other car enthusiasts, Bob and Keith also used to use the machine shop facilities after hours from time to time. He was an extremely good fabricator, Dick remembers. Now, Bob never shirked his civic duty, and he assisted the road maintenance folks by painting 2 lines across a stretch of Cody's sidewalk, Colgate Road. Now, by chance, these happened to be exactly a quarter of a mile apart. Now, back then, there was virtually no traffic on that road Sunday afternoons, and folks would come to test their cars, sometimes against Bob's coupe. The runs lasted only a few seconds. Any complaints were usually because of noise, not because of traffic concerns. One weekend, Bob and Dick asked to borrow the farm truck so they could exchange his engine for a race motor. Bob's father said it was okay as long as they had it back together and back to stock by Monday morning because he had some deliveries to make. That Sunday, when an out-of-towner would lose to the coupe, Bob would ask if he wanted to race the farm truck. The challenger would lose again, to his surprise and spectators' delight. Bob and Dick worked until after midnight that night to get the truck back together and so their dad could use it in the morning. Now, Bob graduated to organized drag racing at Edenville, southeast of Wasaga Beach, and at Kohler Airstrip. Like most racers, he was very secretive about his modifications. The engine hood was always padlocked. However, he often combined secrecy with a wicked sense of humor. Sometimes he would leave empty Canadian Tire spark plug boxes lying in the place where he'd been, and all kinds of other things that didn't make much sense but would kind of confound the competition. To keep spies at bay, and I heard this story for the first time, I thought that can't be, but Dick Patterson said, yeah, that's what we did. To keep people at bay and keep them away from the car, he and Dick would wear manure-tainted coveralls. Obviously, they weren't trying to impress the girls. Now, a lovely story. Once when on the way to Edenville Raceway, they stopped at a drugstore in Stainer, bought a small bottle of ether, which they did sell in drugstores at that time, and after convincing the druggist that they weren't going to use it on any human consumption, and poured some in the coupe's gas tank. Dick asked what that was going to do for the motor, and he said, absolutely nothing, but we're going to have some fun. When they arrived at the raceway with the exhaust reeking of ether, it triggered some very, very serious discussions about what kind of racing fuel Hayward had discovered, and Dick said that some of those guys even stuck their noses up the tailpipe to get a better sniff. Okay. Although Bob was very successful with the old coupe, it was becoming evident it would soon be outclassed. He decided to build a different type of car. Now, folklore has it that Bob built it from used water pipe and other junk. In reality, like all Bob did, it was a carefully thought out project. A London friend, Tom Wilsey, an engineer then with Chrysler's Research and Development Department in Detroit, helped with stress analysis and other design things. Bruce Wells supplied shop space to jig up the chassis for welding. Another of Bob's friends, Ray Hickson, did the welding. It was said he could weld a wristwatch patch on it while you were wearing it. We couldn't verify that, but we'll let it go. Now, each part of this car was weighed before it was added to the car, with a bathroom scale and other high-tech equipment. When it was finished, it was within 10 pounds of its design weight. That wasn't enough to suit Bob, so they put motorcycle wheels on the front to lessen the weight, and the wire, that was the first time a wire wheels had ever been used on a dragster. Bob started with a well-used 6-cylinder overhead valve GMC motor and turned into an almost untouchable powerhouse. The end result, a little ugly, but it was extremely well designed, and it was the first slingshot dragster in the world, where the driver sat behind the rear wheels. A removable body was added from a wrecked car, I think it was a Humber, allowing it to be entered in the coupe class. So it was successfully raced in Canada and on neighboring U.S. raceways. He never showed the competition how fast it would really go. He held it back just going enough to win, to encourage future challenges. There's a story that Bob was quite shy. Dick Patterson wasn't. And they ran through the traps at 117 with the dragster. And he was given an extra plaque because he broke 100 in the quarter mile. And Dick said, gee, he said, I don't know why you guys get all excited about this. He said, the car that we towed this thing in here with can do that. Well, it was Bob's coupe. So one thing led to another. I think some money came out. And Bob said to Dick, he said, you got us into this mess. He said, you drive it. So anyway, they put it on the line. It turned 107. And that was the first time a coupe had ever gone through the 100-mile-an-hour barrier at that track. So they went home with 2 plaques. Now, when the dragster was sold, when Bob joined me at Supertest, rather, the dragster was sold to a fellow by the name of George Herbert in London. And Herbert named it the rickshaw because of the rear driver position. Now, we're talking about miles per hour and this kind of thing. To convert to kilometers per hour, for those folks who want the miles per hour, by the look, I think most of it are in the age range. But if you're not, and you insist on being modern, all you have to do is just mentally multiply miles per hour by 1.609344, and you'll be fine. Okay, this Supertest in the beginnings. Whoops. The Supertest story can be traced back to Ingersoll and the father and son team of Ernie Wilson, who owned the Morrow Screw and Nut and Ingersoll Machine and Tool Companies, and his son Harold. They built and raced a series of boats, the last being the unlimited class boat, Miss Canada IV, and that's represented in this on the far left in this display that Don brought. Now, the unlimited class had no restrictions on engine size and power, and it still is considered the top of the racing pyramid. Aircraft engines were generally used, and now they're using turbine engines. So things have come a long way since those days. Miss Canada IV was a fast boat powered by about a 2,500 horsepower Rolls-Royce Griffin 57, a 12-cylinder aircraft engine used in 12-cylinder, and it was used in the Spitfire fighter. The boat set a world speed record of 143 miles per hour and was said to have unofficially reached over 200 miles an hour. Now, its racing career was plagued by mechanical breakdowns, not uncommon at this level of racing because it's basically all experimental. The Wilsons twice challenged for the U.S. Harmsworth Trophy, considered the world's top powerboat competition. The trophy originated with Alfred Harmsworth, owner of Britain's Daily Mail newspaper, who offered it in 1902 to encourage the development of the motorboat industry through international competition. It attracted the fastest boats and best drivers in the world. Now, this was the first time a Canadian had ever competed for the Harmsworth, which had been dominated by the U.S. almost since the beginning. Both challenges failed, again because of mechanical grumblings. Now, a key rule with the Harmsworth was that the boat had to be built in the country that it was representing, and the equipment and the engine as well. Now, since Canada was part of the British Empire, it was allowed to use British equipment, including engines such as the Griffin. The Griffin was more powerful than the best aircraft engines the Americans had, which were Allisons. So that was a bit of a force. The Wilsons retired from racing in 1951, and the same year another father and son team would take up the story. Gordon Thompson of London, who founded Supertest Petroleum, and his son Jim, an accomplished marine engineer, bought Miss Canada IV from the Wilsons in 1951 to gain experience in unlimited racing. They changed the boat's name to Miss Supertest. From the very beginning, the Thompsons' main goal was to win the Harmsworth for Canada. It would be a long journey. 1952, they used a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine smaller than the Griffin. The reason for that's a long story, which I won't get into. They did not finish their first race because of mechanical failure. In 1953, they installed the larger Griffin, which were by now being sold for nearly nothing at war surplus. They gained racing experience, but the Miss Canada IV, Miss Supertest, could not compete with the new three-point hydroplane design, and it was retired. Now, I should mention, most folks here, I imagine, understand the three-point hydroplane, but basically, it doesn't have a hull that runs in the water like a normal boat. It's basically a shingle, and it has two sponsons on the outside, which you can think of as skis that are down below that flat bottom. So when it comes up to speed, it starts to ride up on the back of those sponsons. And not only that, but because of the design of the propeller and probably some air pressure going under there, the rear of the boat rises. So finally it's running on one half of the propeller, and it's running on part of the rudder. So now you've got a thing that's going along with very low drag, and there's just no way that a conventional hull would keep up unless it was way more power than that. So that's the three-point hydroplane design. It's kind of like if you're doing a push-up. Now, on this Supertest III, for example, the total wetted area when that thing was running was about the size as palms of your hand on each side, plus what the propeller and gear was supporting. Tremendous pressures. I mean, it was a 6,000-pound boat or more. So that's how the three-point hydroplanes worked. They had a new in '54. Thompson had a new three-point hydroplane built by a fellow by the name of Les Acker from Michigan. He built a lot of those boats. Now they still had their eyes on the Harmsworth, so they built the boat in Canada, just across the border, and rather in the U.S. so it would qualify for the Harmsworth. And that was the first time a Griffin had ever been used in a three-pointer. The boat was launched in July the 26th, 1954. It ran its share of races, but it challenged for the Harmsworth in '56 and did not win. Now, a key player in the success of Miss Supertest II was Bruce Wells, a longtime friend of the Thompsons, and he designed and fabricated the critical gearbox and other parts of the boat, and would become an important part of the Thompsons' future success. Now, Wells had been very impressed with the mechanical abilities of a young hot rodder from Embro. As I mentioned before, Bob had been working part-time in his shop, and Wells had helped him a bit with the building of his dragster. When Thompsons were looking for a mechanic, he recommended Bob Hayward. Now, Bob had just landed a job with Chrysler Experimental in Detroit. Not bad for a high school dropout, with no formal mechanical training. And he was waiting for a U.S. work visa. He jumped at the chance to join the Supertest team and came aboard in May of 1957. That's Supertest II. The current driver, Art Asbury, was having some health issues, and the Thompsons were looking for a backup driver. They had an eye on Hayward, but there was another candidate also. Perhaps because of Bob's shy, quiet manner, Gordon Thompson wondered in a memo to his son if Hayward had enough desire to win. A kind of odd observation given his racing success with cars on the dragster. On July 25, 1957, after one of the test runs by Jim Thompson, he asked Bob if he would like to take the boat for a spin. Everybody on the crew knew this was going to happen, except Bob. It was just belief and not a great big grin. And he said, "What I ever." Bob was given more time in the boat, and having a driver who was also a mechanic with intimate knowledge of the engine's strengths and weaknesses was extremely valuable. In the many test and development runs, it would prove even more so in racing. For every hour he spent on driving, he spent perhaps 100 hours working on the engine. It was said he could feel the engine with his body and hear it working through its exhaust. He could get the best out of the Griffin without overtaxing it, and he'd catch a problem before it became a serious issue. And I just One morning at the end of August 1957, the same year that he started driving it, he passed the test to become a qualified unlimited driver. That afternoon, he drove the second heat of the Silver Cup in Detroit, not winning, but running a respectable race. Art Asbury, the full-time driver, set the world speed record of 184.494 miles per hour. Do you want that equation again about? On November the 1st, 1957. That next year, in '58, Bob became the main driver. So that, I go through that because that's how he got to be behind that wheel. His first full race was in the Detroit Memorial, where he drove Supertest II to second place in both heats for third place overall. In July, he and Supertest II won the St. Clair International Boundary Trophy race. He might have won the Gold Cup Regatta over in Seattle, but for engine trouble. He was learning fast and gaining the respect of the fellow drivers. Miss Supertest did, however, have serious balance, spots, and other design issues, which had to be resolved before it could ever win the Harmsworth. Clearly, a new boat was needed. Designed by Jim Thompson specifically for Harmsworth racing, Miss Supertest III was built in London in a chicken barn on the Thompson estate. It would be driven by a former chicken farmer. To top it off, the chief mechanic's name was Vic Leghorn. Some of the press did notice that. It was fun made of it. Colonel Sanders would have been proud. The secrecy was complete, and a photograph like you're looking at would have been very, very rare. That's Bob in the center. He helped with construction and of course, installing the mighty Griffin 64. Now, that Griffin 64 was the last mark of the Griffin series, and it was designed to help get Spitfires high enough to dive on the German jet aircraft, which were becoming a really threat. The hassle ended before the jets really got into their own, but a jet can't fly as high as a piston-powered aircraft that's heavily supercharged. So the Spit could get above the jet and dive on it. And that was the only strategy they had. And then you would get out of there in a hurry if you could knock the jet down. So in June of 1959, Bob and Miss Supertest III won the Ford Memorial Trophy on the Detroit River, beating the top drivers and boats in the U.S. and qualifying for the Harmsworth. They had to win one race to qualify for this Harmsworth. Now, the Windsor Star said, the bashful, extremely modest manner belies a fierce desire to win, wonderful reflexes, and intimate knowledge of his boat. This would be the only time Supertest ever did race in a Harmsworth Challenge, as I said. Supertest II would be used in all the other races. A little confusing. We've got two boats with almost the same name. But on August the 25th, 1959, Bob drove the Supertest III to a record-shattering Harmsworth win. He brought the trophy to Canada after a 39-year stranglehold by the U.S. Record set were best lap speed, best race speed, 104.98 miles per hour, and top average speed at 99.976. Bill Muncy, a veteran U.S. driver of Miss Thriftway, said Hayward showed all of us drivers something. The way he paced his boat, not only in the final race, but in all three, was the most brilliant pacing I've ever seen. Now, there's an interesting story. The dean of motorboat racing was Gar Wood at that time. He'd won the Harmsworth himself several times for the U.S., and he was just a top race driver. He was getting old. He was holding court before the race and explaining to everyone why the Canadians would not have a chance in this race. And he said about the driver, they're sending a boy out to do a man's job. Well, Edith, Bob's mother, heard him say this, and she's not the type to go around yelling and screaming. She thought she could get her point across. So after the Harmsworth win, they were holding court, but it wasn't as happy as it was before the race. And she walked up to Gar Wood and she said, "Well, Mr. Wood, what do you think of my boy now?" He became, the win received heavily national and international media coverage. Bob was given guest spots on national TV shows, and he became Canada's most recognizable sports celebrity almost overnight. Reason for that, I think. The success came at a good time for Canadians. They needed a boost. Canada had high unemployment, high interest rates, serious monetary issues. The Cold War was raging. The Embro-area project, which had created the most advanced fighter plane in the world, and it helped put Canada at the top, almost in the, as certainly a world leader in aerospace technology. That was canceled. It created a brain drain of scientists and folks to the U.S. A lot of them formed the basis for NASA. So it was, you know, none of that was good news. To replace the Arrow and defend against potential Russian attack, Canada bought U.S.-made Bomark missiles, which had debatable effectiveness. And there was wide concern and many conspiracy theories about Americans influencing our economy and government. They weren't good times. And Canadians needed a hero. And along came somebody who put the Americans in their place. You know, it really wasn't about boat racing. It was about winning. It was about national pride. It was all Canadian success story. And I think very much the same as the Toronto Blue Jays winning the World Series in 92 and 93. An awful lot of people that were baseball fans were pretty excited about that. So if you remember those days. Bob continued to campaign Supertest II in 1960, and they defended the Harmsworth in August at Long Reach in Picton. The winner gets to choose the place to race, and it was an ideal spot to run because it was not that rough, the winds weren't too bad, it worked out well. Bob won in 2 heats with superb driving in the turns. This time the Americans were ready. There were 3 boats, very top boats, running against him, and he won in 2 heats. So say with superb driving in those turns. I have to explain that. Why didn't that happen? There we go. A 3-point hydro, because it's got those spots on each side, doesn't corner like an ordinary boat. An ordinary boat will bank into a turn. A 3-point hydro won't do that. It turns like a car because it can't bank. That sponson's holding it up. So they have to handle them quite differently, and they're also a little more dangerous because if something happens to that, the boats can't go over. So this is Hayward's description of how they, and all the turns are left hand on a race course. So this is Hayward's description of how he drove it. He said he prefers to go in at high speed, 140 miles per hour or more. You slow down to about 120 and throw the boat into a broad slide controlled by the accelerator. So he's now skidding sideways. The boat now slows down to about 80 miles an hour. You open the power again using opposite rudder so she won't spin out. So you don't want it to go around this way. So now you're steering the rudder to the right, the opposite side of the turn to hold that boat. And you hold the rudder so she won't spin out. When you line up at the straightaway or if you're skidding around, you just tramp on her. That was his description. So the way that race worked out, in the first heat, he got ahead at the first turn, then used the power and speed of Supertest III to stay there for 45 miles, hitting 170 to 175 miles an hour in the straight stretches. He set a world lap speed record on a 5-mile course of over 126 miles an hour. The record would stand for 20 years. The Americans had some catching up to do. In the second heat, he held a half-mile lead at the end of lap 4 of the 9-lap race. Now, when Bob crossed the finish line, his sense of humor took over. He put on an impromptu show that has become legend. As one reporter described it, Hayward roared past the judges' stand to salute the victory gun with a traditional hand wave. Good so far. Next, he gunned the boat toward a shoreline stand with visiting dignitaries, turned and doused him with spray. He wasn't quite finished. Then Supertest III headed for the race officials, and press area at about 125 miles an hour, sliding and dancing a victory jig on her sponsons. And of course, those that held their ground was drenched as she veered away and headed for the pits. That year, he was awarded the Gold Sports Medal of Honor by the Union of International Motor Boating, based in Ghent, Belgium. Probably not because of that, but because he won the race. So, I apologize for this. I'll leave that slide on. I planned it that way. Now in January, Bob went to Glasgow, Scotland with 2 Griffins to be overhauled by Rolls-Royce technicians. He'd gone once before with Jim Thompson, and he'd been very, very nervous about doing that. He was a high school dropout, as I've said, with no formal mechanical training, facing top engineers and technicians, probably top in the world at Rolls-Royce. It turned out, however, that they were interested in talking to him about the work he'd done on the Griffins here. In June, he drove Supertest II in the Detroit Memorial, winning the first heat, but placing second overall because he made a timing error at the start of the second heat. Now, timing error means the boats started with a flying start. They could go as fast as they wanted to over the start line. But if they went over ahead of the line, they were ahead of the time, they were disqualified. So it was all by time. So they would mill around behind the start line, try to get in a good position to get ahead of everybody else when the race started. And Hayward was good at that too. He was really good at timing the races, particularly when he was up against American boats. If one went over ahead of time, well, there were 2 more left. If he went over, there was nothing left for Canada. So he was good at that. Probably something to do with his drag racing, refluxes, and that kind of thing. Now, in August, of 1961, it was again time to defend the Harmsworth at Long Reach. Now, there was only one U.S. challenger this time, after they saw what Supertest III could do, to talk somebody into racing that boat, putting all that money and time at it. It was getting tougher and tougher to find somebody. They figured that, about 2 ways that they could win. Either the boat would have a mechanical issue, and it wasn't being pushed that hard, so that's kind of maybe not going to happen. The second would be that Bob would tie the boat up and go and have lunch. 2 ways that was going to happen. So Miss Detroit was the defender, and Miss Detroit is this boat. That's Guy Lombardo's boat. He had it about 1.5 years as Tempo 7, and then a fellow in Detroit bought it, called it Short Circuit for a little while. Then he changed the name to Miss Detroit, and it was Miss Detroit, aka Miss Tempo 7, that actually raced the last Harmsworth race with Bob here. So 2 kind of Canadian boats. Tempo was built in the U.S. and didn't run very much in Canada, but Guy Lombardo was a Canadian. So, and that's interesting. You've got 2 boats together here that ran the last Harmsworth race in that unlimited class. So Miss Detroit had engine issues, and in the second heat, Supertest III was 5 miles ahead when it cruised across the finish line. Now, change the slide. Oh! I want to plug in your PC. We're almost. Ignore that slide. Put it out of your mind. A month later, Supertest II was entered in the Silver Cup race at Detroit on Sunday, September the 10th, 1961. The Silver Cup was last brought to Canada in 1948 by Harold Wilson, driving Miss Canada III. In the first heat, Supertest II finished fourth. And Hayward reported that he had struck a course boy marker. No one else saw that, but he fessed up. He said, hey. And he was disqualified. And so that, again, shows what kind of a guy Bob Hayward was. In the second heat, various versions of what happened on the first turn, they vary depending on where you were when you saw it, the vantage points of spectators and drivers. I wish I could show you this, but there was we have a photo of probably one of the last photos ever taken of Miss Supertest II, just coming up to that first turn. And what probably happened was he was on the right-hand side, and he had a bad start. He was making up time. He went into the corner really hot, and he probably cut across and went between the two boats that were on his left-hand side. And it looked as if he was actually ahead of those boats when he caught a sponson. Remember, I said they're kind of unstable, and it was under the Belle Isle Bridge, where the water was quite rough, always in that area. He caught that sponson, and the end result was the boat flipped, went over and over again, and landed right side up. He was probably doing 140 or more when that happened. He was killed instantly. He was 33 years old. The funeral service was held in Knox Presbyterian Church in Embro. More than 800 people signed the guest book. The overflow crowd at the funeral included a who's who of unlimited hydroplane racing drivers and officials. He was buried in the North Embro Cemetery. The Thompsons had been considering retiring from the sport, and Hayward's death sealed the decision. Although Supertest II had suffered very little damage and could have been repaired, the Thompsons stripped the metal out of the boat, cut it up, and burned it piece by piece. The official version is the boat was damaged in a fire. Well, yeah, that's true, it was. Supertest III would never race again either. In 1967, it was given on loan to the Ontario Science Centre in Toronto, where it stayed until 2005. It will now be on display at the Canadian Raceboat Hall of Fame, soon to open near Gravenhurst. Among other boats will be the Wilson's Miss Canada IV, the Gallimbardo's Temple the 7th. So all three major Canadian boats will be there. The Harmsworth Trophy was returned to its trustees in England and was not awarded again for a quarter of a century, but never for unlimited hydroplanes. It's now offered for international powerboat ocean racing competition. There's some ongoing recognition for Bob. The Bob Hayward YMCA in London, which is recently closed, was named after him, of course. He was named to the Canadian Motorsports Hall of Fame in February 2000, and the Woodstock Sports Wall of Fame in 2009. The big thing is on the 50th anniversary of his death on August the 11th, 2011, Picton's Long Reach, where the two Harmsworth races had been run, was renamed Hayward's Long Reach. The town of Picton held an anniversary day honoring Jim Thompson, Bob Hayward, and Miss Supertest III. And the Canadian government, with the nudging of a lot of people, including, I think, Don Goodry had something to do with this, a commemorative stamp. Now, as the last word, there were thousands of words written about Bob Hayward, death, but we'll leave the last word to Jack Dummage of the Windsor Star, a reporter who followed him very, very intensely through his racing career and knew him well. He summed up the feelings of many Canadians when he wrote, "Hayward, in a brief space of time, became a heroic figure, symbolizing for Canadians a high kind of international mastery in an area when Canadians needed it most. His courage was a fearlessness tempered with gentleness. He was the greatest driver of a powerboat that ever stepped into one. The invincibility of Supertest III was Hayward, a man who lived and died by the challenge, who broke every Harmsworth lap and speed record in the book, who was never defeated in a Harmsworth event. Thank you. So we'll now have some questions and answers. We'll shake the microphone loose here, or maybe we could, how do I work this? By hand? Or?
I think you've answered all the questions, so we're our job done.
We can wait for those speakers.
So has anybody got any questions that they need answered? I can answer the odd one, but
What year did the Bob Hayward Y open in London?
I believe it was 1966.
Was it? Thank
It
you.
just closed the end of November this year. Lack of participation, I believe.
One of your earlier slides showed a motor, outboard motor of about 1929 vintage. I happen to have one like that. The Johnson Seahorse.
Yep, Johnson Seahorse 33.
Is that what it was?
Yep, they were an Army surplus.
Yeah.
An Army surplus engine.
I think mine's about a 10. It takes 13 men and a bulldog to but it's real full.
Must have some alcohol locked in the cylinder.
Yeah. I've never run it, but it does have spark. Good run.
One out of the three is already there, so.
Yeah.
Anything else anybody's
Scott,
wondering about?
remember you made those CDs, or you had those CDs made with a bunch of the race footage and stuff like that? Do you still have any of those left?
I still have a master copy.
Oh, just the master copy.
But you can download it. It's all that stuff's on YouTube now.
Oh, it's on YouTube.
You can download all that stuff. I have a bunch of stuff that's like Super 8 or 8 millimeter.
Yeah.
No sound, but I've never ever duplicated them. But yeah, you can pretty much get everything off the internet now.
Thanks.
The internet's good for something. Anything else in anybody's mind? Oh, I don't know. Governor off the farm tractor. Get some more RPMs out of it so they can go a little faster so they can get back working on something they want to work on. You know, scratching dirt and feeding chickens. I don't even know what they used for a lawnmower back in the day.
Self-propelled, no air tires.
Well, maybe you can answer that. You know anything?
Just like to put a plug in for the Canadian Raceboat Hall of Fame, opening July. It's a 15,000 square foot, $5.4 million project, just west of Bracebridge. You'll have Miss Canada 3, replica. You have Miss Canada 4, aka Supertest 1. You have Supertest 3, and you'll also have Gal Lombardo's Temple 7, aka Miss Detroit. I like to think I had a hand in getting Temple 7 out of London after 40 years of being battered around in London. So, so keep an eye on Facebook, Canadian Raceboat Hall of Fame, and we're up that way in the Muskokas. Drop in, see it. There's also a venue area seating 150 people for events, banquets, weddings, stuff like that. They claim I'm number 2 on the invite list. I'm proud to be a team member.
I guess there are no more questions?
Doug, thank you very much.
Oh.
You have brought in more people than I've ever seen.
Bob Hayward that brought these people in.
Yes, I know. Decided to speak about it. And I've been hearing about him since I was little. Which was a long time ago. Yeah, I know I'm still little. But I was even smaller then. But yes, I heard about him a long time ago, and I found him a very interesting person, and I'm glad you brought him to light.
We just want to thank you all for coming out tonight. This is our biggest turnout yet for Speaker Series. Yeah, we all know this room has been quite crowded, and there has been a few people in other rooms. But luckily we do have this presentation recorded. So it will be available on our Facebook page, and we're hoping to also come out with a YouTube link. And we'll send that to those interested. So if you were having a hard time hearing, especially for those of you who are in other rooms hearing me now, we'll have this recorded for people who want to see it at home as well. And if you have any, if you want to share it with friends and family as well. So just wanted to note that. Thanks so much for coming. There will be coffee, tea, refreshments outside. So make your way out there, tour on the museum. We have tours available if you'd like to view a few rooms. And yeah, thanks for coming. I don't know if Doug has anything else to share, but nope, we're good. Okay, thank you so much.